Hey Trinity, and welcome back to the third and final installment of why I don't think that having National Guard and military troops deployed in our cities is a good idea. In this third segment, I want to talk about what the troops are actually doing out on our streets. Is it effective? Are there other options that are potentially more effective for reducing crime in our cities? Also, what the ramifications are for the communities where the troops are being deployed. So the role that our National Guard troops are being asked to play is called visual deterrence, and it is a technique used in law enforcement to reduce certain types of crimes, and it is effective in certain places in certain ways for reducing certain crimes. In large public areas like subways or city centers or places where there's lots of folks out on the street, just the visual presence of a law enforcement person can reduce criminals from wanting to ply their trade in the areas where those folks are patrolling. Deterrence can also be done by having actual law enforcement people who have been trained and have the tools, equipment, and communications to be able to enforce the law. If they do see criminal activity, is much preferable to having untrained people out on the streets. As a tool for reducing crime, visual deterrence has some limitations. For example, criminals will tend to just move their criminal operations to some place where patrols aren't being conducted. And that's not helpful for actually reducing crime in an area. It just moves it around to other places. Visual deterrence also doesn't help prevent any crimes that are occurring in private spaces. And that includes a lot of the crimes that are sort of the most heinous, worst crimes that we see in law enforcement. Things like domestic abuse, child abuse and endangerment, sexual assaults, and homicides, which aren't deterred by visual policing. Another area of criminal activity that is not going to be deterred by the presence of military forces in our cities is anybody who wants to conduct a major terrorist attack where the presence of military troops just doesn't matter to those folks and they're going to do it anyway. And of course, having our military out on the streets doesn't prevent any sort of financial crimes like falsifying business records or embezzlement or fraud or any of the things that fall under what is known as white collar crime. So visual deterrence as a law enforcement technique is really more about making the public feel safe than it is about meaningfully reducing crime in a given area. Throwing people out without training, experience, and equipment is just asking for somebody to get hurt or killed, and that's going to happen. So now let's touch on how this operation is affecting our communities. The first subject that I'm going to get into here is the cost. I heard on a reputable news source within the last few days that it's costing approximately $1 million a day to have the National Guard and military forces deployed in Washington, D.C. If it were extended for an entire year, that would be $365 million of federal taxpayer money being used for a force that is essentially going to be ineffective in actually reducing crime. There are other tools in our society that can be used to reduce crime, and they require money as well. So things like housing assistance and food programs and educational programs and counseling and alcohol and drug addiction recovery programs and violence reduction programs with younger people in cities, business loans and other business opportunities, and things that provide people a better economic outlook are much more effective at actually reducing most types of crime in the long term than having visible deterrence forces deployed in any given area. And if we really want to have a meaningful reduction in violent crime in the United States, perhaps it's time to pass some common sense gun control laws. I was a police officer, I carried a gun, I believe in the Second Amendment just as strongly as I do the others, but let's face it, folks, it's probably time to do that. So deploying the military troops into our cities is unconstitutional. It doesn't make sense from a training standpoint. There are other ways to go about doing it. So this is really about making a show of force to get political points for appearing to be strong on crime by doing something that's really not effective across the board. And instead of making things better in the neighborhoods that they're being deployed to already have had long-standing problems with law enforcement for things like racial profiling and abuses of authority and excessive force and unwarranted shootings and a lot of other problems that already make the relationship between the people living in those neighborhoods and law enforcement strained at best. So deploying troops into our cities is not going to make those people feel any safer. It's just going to make them more afraid. Our Constitution was written to protect the individual people of our country. And it's supposed to provide safety and stability for the people. And that includes safety from unlawful, inappropriate uses of force by our government. And it appears that the abuses that our Constitution are supposed to be preventing are becoming more prevalent in this administration, and people's rights are being violated and due process is being violated. And this use of military force and National Guard troops is nothing but a Trojan horse to get people to give up their freedoms for this illusion of being more safe. So what can an individual do here at this point? We need to know our civil rights. We need to know what the police can and can't do when making contact with us as citizens. We need to know what our rights are in observing police actions, and that we can in fact videotape law enforcement as long as we are not interfering with their operations. We need to understand that we have the right to an attorney and that we must insist upon legal representation. So if you're detained or arrested, you need to stand up for your rights. Don't voluntarily give up your rights, because that's what our Constitution was written for, was to protect all of us. In addition to standing up for your own rights, we also all need to be standing up for the rights of our friends, neighbors, and other members of our community who are being targeted for harassment and illegal and unconstitutional actions by this administration. And we do that by participating in social protests like the ones that have happened here on Labor Day weekend again. Deterrence can also be done by having actual law enforcement people who have been trained and have the tools, equipment, and communications to be able to enforce the law. If they do see criminal activity, is much preferable to having untrained people out on the streets. Throwing people out into those capacities without training, experience, and equipment is just asking for somebody to get hurt or killed, and that's going to happen. To reach out to your local government officials, city officials, county officials, state officials like representatives and state senators and governors, attorneys general, and all of the folks that are operating as elected officials within our judicial system, as well as our federal level people, our senators and Congress people who are supposed to be representing our rights as citizens, not pandering to the whims of somebody who is acting more and more like a king and a dictator. And I also want to tell all of you out there to please be safe, especially in areas where these troops are being deployed. They don't have the training and experience and knowledge and resources to be able to interact with you in any sort of constitutionally meaningful way. So if you can avoid contact with them at all, please do. And that's going to wrap up this 3-part series of why I, Renee, a transgender woman who served as a police officer, doesn't believe that having the military or the National Guard troops performing any sort of law enforcement functions, including deterrence, in our cities is appropriate. I hope this has been informative for you and mildly, in some ways, entertaining. Probably not so much, but there we go. So thanks again for watching. I appreciate you all, and have a good day. Bye.